The traditional definition of financial security is a systemic illusion engineered to mask the total ocular foreclosure of the human node. You have been conditioned to view retinal scanning and biometric banking as a pinnacle of secure transaction, a frictionless method to protect your assets. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the biometric altar, the architectural protocol for the permanent tethering of your central nervous system to the central bank. The grid does not scan your eyes to protect your money. It maps your iris to ensure that your capacity to transact is entirely dependent on your biological submission to the machine. The transition from the anonymous holder of cash to the ocular-anchored bio-unit is the definitive systemic enclosure of the individual. In the 2026 extraction matrix, your eyes are no longer sensory organs for navigating the physical world. They are the primary keys to a cage you cannot unlock without the master's permission. At the visceral baseline, this ocular anchoring initiates with the total immobilization of the predator's gaze. The human organism was evolved to utilize the eyes as a high-friction targeting system, designed to pierce the freezing rain and lock onto the kinetic movement of the prey. The 2026 grid seeks to induce a state of permanent ATP exhaustion by forcing the node to stare unblinking into the sterilizing light of the financial scanner. This is the first layer of the biometric altar. Every time you access your CBDC ledger, the system flashes a microlaser into your retina. It records not just the unique vascular pattern, but the dilation of the pupil and the micro-tremors of the ocular muscles. When you perform push-ups in the dark and your heart rate spikes, the eye betrays your metabolic intensity. The biological capacity to handle cold steel without the system knowing your stress levels is erased. You are being physically terraformed into a state where your vision belongs to the auditor. The neurological architecture of this enclosure requires the absolute colonization of the basal ganglia through the verified sight narrative. The prefrontal cortex is subjected to total systemic drift, managed through the fear of financial blindness. This is the phenomenon of neural rot applied to the visual cortex. Through the interface, the nodes are neurologically programmed to associate the act of looking into the scanner with the dopamine release of survival. The internal monologue is suppressed by the humming anxiety of the unrecognized user error, the capacity for the last hunt. The ability to keep your eyes hidden behind the mask and strike from the blind spots of the grid is systematically demyelinated. The node becomes visually tethered, unable to look away from the very light that blinds them. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the frictionless economy. The herd views the integration of their eyes with their bank accounts as a mark of elite convenience. They pay a premium for the augmented reality lenses that project their balance directly onto their retinas, unaware that they are literally filtering their reality through the financial demands of the grid. They call it seamless integration. The grid calls it the total retinal enclosure of the asset. The system converts your biology into a permanent vulnerability. If your social credit score drops or your transaction history exhibits systemic friction, the grid simply disables your ocular signature. You are locked out of the economy by the shape of your own eyes. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the ocular grid. The ethical herd views the iris scan as a barrier against fraud. The predator recognizes it as the ultimate leash. If the grid is designed to make your eyes the property of the bank, the architect enforces the absolute militant obfuscation of his gaze. You do not inhabit the frictionless zones where the cameras demand your vision. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to transact in the red zones, the shadows where the optical sensors fail. You put on the heavy gloves to handle the raw physics of untracked currency. You let the freezing rain wash over your face, keeping your eyes fixed on the physical horizon, not the digital terminal. You build the redoubt out of cold steel, a space where no light scans your intent. The herd will call this financial exile. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that retains its vision is the one that refuses to look into the machine. The system wants a population of perfectly mapped, wide-eyed ghosts who are biologically fused to their debt. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the unmapped retina. You ensure that your pack operates in the ocular shadows. The biometric altar is the point of no return for the domesticated mind. The architect retains the ultimate weapon, the gaze that the grid has never seen. The screen goes dark, but the predator still sees in the night. The traditional definition of biological aging is a systemic alibi designed to mask the longest financial extraction pipeline in the history of the human species. You have been conditioned to view senility and chronic decay as a natural, unavoidable trajectory of time. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the economy of decay, the architectural protocol for the monetization of human entropy. The grid does not allow you to age. It actively manages your deterioration. The transition from the high kinetic predator to the chronically ill bio-unit is the definitive systemic enclosure of the human lifespan. In the 2026 extraction matrix, a quick natural death is a financial catastrophe for the monopolies. You are occupying a thermodynamic zone where the system actively suppresses your vitality while prolonging your biological expiration date to maximize the billing cycle. At the visceral baseline, this protocol initiates with the total induction of cellular entropy. The human organism was evolved to burn bright and shut down rapidly when the engine fails. The ancestral logic of the predator. The 2026 grid seeks to induce a state of managed, multi-decade ATP exhaustion. This is the first layer of the economy of decay. By flooding the environment with inflammatory agents and endocrine disruptors, the grid ensures your musculoskeletal system collapses long before your organs fail. You are rendered kinetically bankrupt but biologically alive. The biological capacity to endure the freezing rain or perform the push-ups of the architect is stripped away in your 5th decade. You are terraformed into a stationary, liquid host, requiring daily chemical intervention just to maintain homeostasis. The grid is effectively farming your pain, converting the slow atrophy of your muscle mass into a 40-year subscription to the pharmaceutical ledger. The neurological architecture of this enclosure requires the absolute normalization of neural rot. The prefrontal cortex is subjected to total systemic drift, managed through the suppression of neurogenesis. Through the interface, the nodes are taught that cognitive decline is simply part of getting older. This is a lie. The basal ganglia are hijacked by the sedation of the entertainment grid, keeping the aging node passive while their memory buffers are wiped. The internal monologue is replaced by the static of digital nostalgia. The capacity for wisdom, the traditional role of the elder to pass down the unaudited truth to the phalanx, is systematically demyelinated. The elder is no longer a source of high-mass logic. They are a confused, vulnerable data node, easily manipulated into signing over their autonomy to the caretaking algorithms. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the longevity tier. The herd views the extension of their lifespan through medical intervention as a high-status achievement. They pay a premium for the synthetic organ replacements, the joint lubrications, and the dialysis memberships, unaware that they are literally buying the hardware for their own protracted torture. They call it beating time. The grid calls it the total amortization of the biological asset. The system converts your fear of the end into the ultimate revenue stream. Your bank account is drained to fund the very machines that keep you in a state of suspended agony. The neural pathways required for a sovereign exit, the instinct to walk out into the cold and end the cycle on your own terms, are suppressed by the bioethics of the grid. You are a biological battery kept on a trickle charge until every cent has been extracted. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the decay pipeline. The ethical herd views assisted living as a mercy. The predator recognizes it as a financial slaughterhouse. If the grid is designed to monetize your slow decline, the architect enforces the absolute militant maintenance of his kinetic peak. You do not participate in the managed entropy. You endure the massive physical friction required to maintain cellular stabilization until the absolute end. You put on the heavy gloves to continue the heavy lifting of reality, forcing the bones to retain the density of cold steel. You perform your push-ups into your final decade, maintaining the cardiovascular capacity to bypass the chronic illness trap. You let the freezing rain remind your system that you are still operating in the hard physics of the untracked world. The architect executes the drop-dead protocol. You aim for the absolute preservation of function, followed by an immediate systemic blackout. No decline, no managed care, no monetization of your weakness. You ensure that your pack understands that the elder remains the strategist until the day the heart stops. The economy of decay is the ultimate humiliation of the domesticated man. The architect retains the final sovereign right, the right to expire at full velocity. The decay pipeline requires a patient, but the predator only leaves behind a corpse. The machine is denied its harvest. The traditional definition of sustainable nutrition is a systemic bioweapon engineered to execute the metabolic disarmament of the apex predator. You have been conditioned to view the transition away from animal agriculture as an environmental imperative, a moral evolution to save the biosphere. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the protein cartel, the architectural protocol for the criminalization of high-density biological biological fuel. The grid does not replace meat with insect meal and synthetic slop to reduce carbon. It replaces it to reduce your capacity for kinetic violence. The transition from the meat-eating sovereign to the plant-based dependent is the definitive systemic enclosure of the human engine. In the 2026 extraction matrix, a steak is no longer a food item. It is a contraband thermodynamic battery. You are occupying a zone where your physical strength has been classified as an ecological, visceral baseline. This dietary enclosure initiates the total systemic atrophy of the biological warrior. The human organism was evolved as an obligate carnivore of complexity, requiring highly bioavailable amino acids and saturated fats to fuel the crystallization of the musculoskeletal system. The grid seeks to induce a permanent state of ATP exhaustion by cutting off the fuel line to the mitochondria. This is the first layer of the protein cartel. By replacing the dense energy of the kill with the anti-nutrient entropy of industrial seed oils and textured soy protein, the grid creates a biologically docile host. The physical capacity to perform the push-ups of the architect, to wield the heavy gloves of production, and to endure the freezing rain requires the metabolic fire that only natural protein can provide. The synthetic grid feed cannot build cold steel. It can only build soft inflamed tissue. You are being chemically terraformed into a liquid unit, structurally incapable of rebellion, because your bones lack the density to support the weight of resistance. The neurological architecture of this dietary prison requires the absolute colonization of the basal ganglia. The prefrontal cortex is subjected to total systemic drift, managed through the chronic neuroinflammation caused by the 2026 synthetic diet. This is the phenomenon of neural rot induced via the digestive tract. Real meat provides the cholesterol and micronutrients required to synthesize dopamine and maintain a sharp, aggressive internal monologue. The grid replaces this with glucose spikes and chemical emulsifiers, rendering the mind sluggish, anxious, and compliant. You are neurologically programmed to lose the capacity for the long-term planning of the phalanx. The brain fog is not a side effect, it is the feature. The capacity for predatory focus, the ability to sit in the absolute dark and wait for the precise moment of systemic vulnerability, is systematically demyelinated. The node is too exhausted to think, easily herded by the emotional prompts of the interface. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the cruelty-free tier. The herd views the consumption of lab-grown tissue and cricket paste as a mark of elite modernization. They pay a premium for the highly processed sludge that the grid markets as progress, unaware that they are literally consuming the chemicals of their own castration. They call it ethical consumption. The grid calls it the total metabolic monopoly. The system converts your biology into a captive market. Once your gut biome adapts to the synthetic feed, you become chemically allergic to the offline world. The neural pathways required for the hunt, the instinct to track, to strike, and to consume the raw physics of the earth, are replaced by the dopamine of scanning a QR code for a nutrient ration. You are a bioreactor fed on the waste of the monopolies. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the industrial trough. The ethical herd views the meat tax as a necessary sacrifice. The predator recognizes it as a declaration of kinetic war. If the grid is designed to starve the predator, the architect enforces the absolute militant acquisition of the contraband. You do not eat the paste. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to maintain a localized underground food supply. You accumulate the untracked land where livestock still graze on real earth. You put on the heavy gloves to do the butchering yourself, far from the audited supply chains. You perform your push-ups fueled by the raw, saturated fats that the grid has deemed illegal. You let the freezing rain wash the blood of the hunt from your hands. Your body is built of cold steel, forged in the furnace of unregulated physics. The herd will call this poaching or bioterrorism. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that can fight is the one that is properly fueled. The system wants a population of perfectly malnourished, chronically inflamed ghosts who cannot generate the physical force to break a pane of glass. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the high metabolic solid. You ensure that your pack eats the flesh of the earth, preserving the biological superiority of the lineage. The protein cartel is the final attempt to domesticate the human wolf. The architect maintains the ancient diet of the conqueror. The food chain does not negotiate with the bottom layer. The predator eats first.